correction officers of Reddit. Have you ever met an inmate that was actually a very nice person but did absolutely horrifying crimes? If so, what's their story? From my personal experience, the nicest inmates are usually the ones who have committed the worst crimes: murder, act. The ones that always give you problems are the guys that get arrested for minor shit like petty theft, cannabis, loitering. Heck, they always come in with major attitudes that never ends well. I suspect it's some sort of survivor bias effect, people in for petty shit on you to the system, so you'll have a variety of attitudes. Convicts who are on year 15 of their sentences, they've figured out how to keep their head down. Either they always were model inmates or they had their attitudes adjusted. I'm assuming that the sort of people who start fights with everyone and spit on the guards don't make it 15 years. Former CO here. I had two guys in my unit that strangled their newborns when they wouldn't stop crying. One of them was drinking and trying to watch a hockey game. His daughter wouldn't stop crying. He got annoyed, walked over and just choked her until she stopped. The other guy's story was somewhat similar, but I can't remember the details. They were both porters in that housing unit. They were doing a lot of time. Can't remember exactly how much they were given. One guy was already at year 16. Probably two of the nicest guys I met while on the job. They didn't come off as crazy degenerates and seemed like genuinely nice guys. I used to stand in the day room and have some interesting convos with them and their little crew they called the trailer trash circle or something to that effect. I had a guy who used to say he killed a guy while high on cocaine. Yeah, the guy was his 3-year-old son. Dude was the best porter, was my block clerk at one point, and always tried to pass on any info he heard if he thought one of us officers would end up getting hurt. Had a kid a few years ago and went to all the classes. We were told probably a dozen times that it's okay to become frustrated with your baby, and if you are at your limit to put them down in their crib and walk away for a few minutes. Take a breather outside, etc. It seemed weird hearing it so many times, but it honestly really helped knowing that was an option. I did it a few times when I became really frustrated, and cooling off for a few minutes made a world of difference. I think this was literally the only advice my mother gave me when I was pregnant. She said, "Look, extract or cream. It's never excusable, but I kinda understand how babies get shaken. You're going to possibly want to hurt the baby if it doesn't stop crying. You just put them in their crib and walk away. Nothing bad will happen if the baby cries for a few minutes on their own. Walk away." She was so forceful about it, it made me wonder how close I came to not growing up. I had pretty serious stomach issues when I was a baby, so I screamed and cried more than I slept. My dad was also in the army and spent more time deployed than he did at home. So my mom was alone with newborn me. One time she told me that she was just absolutely at her wits' end and feeling like she was losing her mind, so she brought me to the ER and said, "Please help me figure out why she cries so much. I am worried that I am going to throw her, so I brought her here instead." Shocking, but also thanks for not throwing me. I sincerely hope thanks for not throwing me on all your Mother's Day cards. I once had to put my now 3-year-old son down in his crib and walk away because I was so exhausted and had major post-baby depression that I almost shook him. I felt like an awful person. I called my doctor the next day and got help. Now he is in the terrible 3 stage, and there are times I still have to walk away or let him cry for a few minutes in his room. I know he is safe in his room, and I know I need a break too. I called a friend once to ask what you're supposed to do when you don't want to touch them. She knew instantly that I'd gotten to that place. She said, very cheerfully, "Well, I used to imagine throwing mine against the wall. An hour later she was at my door with a little care package for me. It's very hard to be proud of every moment as a parent. Easier if you can find out it's perfectly normal to lose your shit from exhaustion and frustration. As long as you don't touch the kid in that state. When I was in college I went home one weekend and ended up staying out all night drinking. I got home, showered and got into bed. Almost immediately my niece, who was teething, started wailing. I had zero responsibility for the kids since my sister and our parents were home. But as I was laying there, exhausted and feeling like shit, I suddenly thought, I understand why people shake babies. I immediately felt awful. I definitely don't condone it, but I suddenly understood it. I'm glad it seems like it's being talked about, and not just shaking babies is bad but also ways to handle it. Sometimes you have to walk away and let them cry for a little bit. You feel bad at first but it's needed sometimes. Even letting a family member take the baby for a few hours so you can sleep or whatever. They'll make you feel like you're going crazy lol. Nobody tells you that sometimes your baby wants set down too. A handful of times in my kid's life I would be at my limit, set him down, and he would instantly start calming down. To the surprise of no one he's turned out to be an introvert. It's absolutely necessary. I never thought I would want to punch a baby until I was so tired I could barely operate and he would only stop crying if I was holding him and walking around. Sometimes you just need to put them safely in a crib and get out of the room for your own sanity. I got super lucky with these babies, and I never understood the whole shaking baby thing. Then my sister had a baby. Colic hit and she asked if I'd come sit with her because she was struggling. Holy cow, hours upon hours of endless crying affected me way more than I thought possible. People don't understand till they've experienced it. It's really rough. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of stories in this thread, including these, were largely down to addiction, and then when they did something so horrendous they decided to stop, found it harder to continue and in prison. I tutored in juvie. One of the boys had murdered 3 people for a gang initiation and when asked, had absolutely no remorse for it. He was a very nice, polite, and intelligent kid though who would draw me little pictures and always tried extra hard on his creative writing assignments. Had a very good sense of humor too and often made everyone in the room laugh and smile. I honestly had trouble reminding myself that he was a cold-blooded murderer. Holy shit. But did you ever get any backstory on why he got into a gang? Kids can be easily conditioned into being murderers, especially when they come from neglected backgrounds. Juvie was probably the first stable environment he has ever had. Gang environments and families can be very stable, loving, and provide all the education and advantages they can for their kids. Think about all of this child's commendable behaviors. Someone taught and modeled that for him every day, but it's within context of the gang's culture. Think about religious evangelicals, or intense racist towns. They don't love their kids any less, and don't neglect them, but they do teach some fucked up shit. Christ, my wife almost died like this. She was in Los Angeles, in her 20s. Some kid, she said about 14-15, pointed a gun at her and told her to turn around and stare at the wall. She knew the drill and knew what was going to happen. So she told the kid he was going to have to shoot her while looking into her eyes. The kid ran off. That was 40 years ago. She still suffers from PTSD from it. The kid probably got fucked up from others in his gang to before being a pussy too. I teach yoga to kids in juvie. It's the highest security facility in my state and some of the kids have been there for years. I'm not supposed to talk with them about what they're in for, but some will try to tell me anyway. Honestly, I don't want to know because I don't want it to affect how I treat them. My dad worked as a doctor in a prison for a short time. Came back with lots of stories of the inmates. He said he talked to one guy who was always friendly and chill. Found out the guy had a life sentence and asked the guy why he was in prison. The guy said he had a bad lawyer. My dad looked up his information later on and it turned out he had murdered his own daughter. So yay, never judge a book by its cover. The sad truth is, if he had a good lawyer, he might not be in prison. He wasn't really wrong. Not a CO but worked in a psych ward. In this case the guy went to prison and was eventually stepped down to our psych ward. He had stabbed his dad multiple times and killed him. He was with us for around a year, so I saw him 5-6 times a week, anywhere from 8-14 hours each shift. He was so kind and polite. You would never think he had done anything remotely shocking. When his relationship with his dad would come up, he would talk so calmly and normally. No real hatred or anger. Yet he murdered him. If there were ever fights on the ward, he would look out for staff and other patients. I won't lie. He was a delight. TLDR. Worked with a murderer. He was one of my nicest patients. What were the circumstances of his murdering his father? Was it just out of nowhere or did they get into a fight? Obviously it doesn't make the crime any less horrific. But people like that are always fascinating because their friendly personality would never betray such a brutal crime. If I remember rightly, his father just pissed him off one day. On the other hand though, I worked with another patient who had killed 3 people. All accidentally and on 2 separate occasions. He was haunted by what he had done. How do you accidentally kill 3 people spread out, not just over 1 occasion, but 2? Right? When someone kills their parent, I always suspect that the parent had been hurting them somehow, and the attack was a crime of defense, retaliation for past wrongs. And X200B. Maybe not the case I roll, but that's always the feeling I get. My husband is a CO. The guys he talks about actually sound like good people. Then I ask what they did and it will always be a murderer or guy who spent years raping his own kids. Sounds like your husband is a personable man. Having the ability to casually interact with people who've done horrible things on a daily basis is probably one of the most important skills to have in an environment like that. This is why I generally didn't ask what the IMs did to get them in there. It's the golden rules. Never ask them why they're there. Never ask them when they're getting out. They'll tell you if they want you to know. I was performing a shakedown on the Stalker Porter, housing unit cleaner, who was a really nice guy. This was a housing unit for generally older IMs. So I was looking through his property box and found some court documents. Unfortunately I started reading them. He and another guy had been in a mugging and shot and killed a man who was an off-duty sheriff's deputy, I believe. These were court transcripts, and I read that he claimed he didn't want to kill the guy but that the gun went off. That was back in the 70s, and he had been in prison for around 40 years or so. God, this sorta shit fucks me up. Then you hear about rapists getting like 2-year sentences. You know they all say the gun just went off, right? I am not saying there are not good people in there, but it is human nature to mitigate your role in the events afterward. Not a company, RN here. I've taken care of a fair amount of detained prisoners that have been admitted to the hospital. I usually ask them what got him locked up cause I'm nosy. I had one super pleasant middle-aged guy tell me his story. Apparently he and his wife were going through or had gone through an ugly split. They were already separated when someone broke into his house with a weapon intending to hurt him. He wound up killing the guy in self-defense. I assume he had a gun or something. But not before he found out his wife had arranged it. She hired a hitman to come kill him. But, instead of going to the police after, he went to his wife's place and killed her outright. Super friendly guy though. No idea how much of that was true, but that's definitely the craziest story I've heard from an inmate. If you're ever curious, you can ask the officers watching the inmate. They might not know details, but they have a rap sheet that summarizes crimes committed. None of it is privileged information. And most COs actually appreciate nurses caring about safety and security. Your last sentence specifically absolutely. This goes for anyone coming into a correctional environment. Whether you're a volunteer or teacher or whatever, we're not arseholes. We're trying to keep everyone safe. So please listen to us when we ask you to do, or not do, something. 2 stories in one. I worked as a CO for a private prison in TN before I moved with my FNK to VA. One of our units had a guy who was always generally nice and respectful. He was the stand-up comic of the group in that unit. He would speak with any new young guys that came in. Led the prayer group for guys on Sundays in the day room etc etc. My last day in the state before I moved. His name was on the news. Turns out he was in jail for vehicular manslaughter while driving under the influence of meth. Needless to say, I was quite shocked by the crime because he didn't seem to be that guy. The other story comes from when I was a student in community college. I got the chance to do interviews on death row in TN. Most death row inmates were the most respectful and honest men I've ever met. We wouldn't speak about their cases due to legal reasons that could cause problems with their appeals, but we would ask questions about their lives and families. One of the guys was a phenomenal artist. You could give him a picture of something and he would draw it out with pencils. It would look exactly like the picture you had given him. People still look at me in shock when I tell them that death row was the most calm and chilled time I've ever spent in a corrections environment. I even felt the safest working with these gentlemen in their unit because they policed their own behavior. I watched a Netflix documentary about how death row is actually one of the best places to be in prison. More freedom, better food, etc. Is this true at this prison? Just curious. So in TN there is something called a level system where the number of freedoms are restricted based upon a designated level. There were 3 levels, A, B, C, with A being the highest restrictions and C being more low level. Inmates who were on level A restrictions were sequestered in their cells for 23 hours a day, had a 5-man armed team that did escorts, and had to be constantly under lock and key when being moved around. Men who were level A had usually just been moved into the unit following their trial and sentencing. But there were also guys who they called permas. Permas were guys who were just absolutely violent in their behavior, caused harm against officers and staff, and would never ever be moved from their level restrictions. After a certain amount of time they would move you down a level or up a level based on behavior. Guys who were level C could move freely around the unit, keep their doors open. They had access to schooling that most of them used. Pretty much every death row inmate I spoke to was a paralegal. They even had jobs. There were guys who cleaned the units and worked in the kitchen. Death row had a separate kitchen. All in all, it was just a regular prison, but most inmates were well behaved because they were working to save their lives. Any instance of violence could hurt their case. To answer the food question, all prison food in the US sucks. Private or public, those guys survive on buying stuff from commissary. Do you believe, personally or professionally, that an extended period of solitary confinement is cruel and unusual punishment? I was put in solitary for a few days. I preferred it to being locked in a cell with another dude. I don't consider myself antisocial but socially challenged, introverted, awkward, high anxiety around others, etc. Like someone said, it depends on the personality. Not a company. Took a class in a prison. It was half college students, half inmates. Our Tay was in for 25 to life. He was an amazingly smart and nice person. His crime? He killed the guy that raped his sister. It was inspirational to see someone who was in such a bad situation trying to make the best of it. Edit. Added link to national program I participated in to take this class since so many people were asking about it. The Inside Out Center webpage. Ugh. A few months ago, we had an inmate finally get released. He killed the guy who raped his niece. Now, in his case, he was going on her word, but the murder victim was the rapist. But this guy still did 20 years. I worked at a pizza place and we delivered pizza to a party one time. The guy was having a last hurrah before he went to prison for killing his daughter's rapist. The driver refused payment and bought the pizza out of his own pocket. Murder and vigilantism are still crimes. Yeah, but people forget that laws are just pieces of paper when you don't give a shit. There's also the old rule of what's good for thee isn't for me. Basically, if you've got enough cash to manipulate the game, laws don't really apply to you. My deal is people seem to forget about the good old jury nullification. If you don't think it's a just punishment for what was done, you vote not guilty. I got to play softball against the inmates at the Fed Med here in town. The first time in was pretty scary, but it ended up being the best couple hours of softball I've ever played. Everyone was real nice, just joking around the whole time. Just like playing with the guys. It was pretty hard to believe that they were hardened criminals when we were all out there enjoying a game together. They had guys with a PA system calling the game while we played, ribbing everyone that got within 10 feet of them. Inmates would come up to our dugout telling us they had bets on our team so we better win, or hit it to that guy. He sucks. I do remember when I was at bat. The catcher told me to hit to the center fielder who was a pedophile. He used the prison slang for it. I can't remember, and I had no idea what he meant. In the end, everyone was super nice and fun. Again, for those few hours I forgot I was in a federal prison playing against people who did some horrible things. And X200B. Edit. The guys calling the game noticed my bright red cleats and called me door thief for the rest of the game. So that was nice. And X200B. Edit. The pedophile slang has been solved. It was chomo. And X200B. Edit cubed. This is my most upvoted comment ever. Neato. Feel free to ask any questions about it. It was really quite the experience. Skinner, Diddler, those are the only two that come to mind. Edit. In hindsight, that was a weird search phrase for Google while at work. XCO here. Had a man who shot and killed one state trooper and shot another in the groin. He sat as a sniper in the woods and shot the troopers through the windows of the barracks. It was premeditated and he nearly got away with it. He was on FBI most wanted list for a good 2 months. The marshals caught him as he was getting ready to take off on a hang glider. Anyway, he was the most mild-mannered inmate I had met. Always reading. Never turned down his R4 rec. Always finished his plate, etc. Anyway, I was doing an escort with another officer to take him to visitation. He was to wear double-locked shackles and cuffs when not in his cell. Even in the showers, I was holding his arm and assisting him so he wouldn't trip, and I felt his bicep flex and he just stopped walking and looked at me. I realized at that moment that he could overpower me without much effort, shackles or not. Turns out he just had to sneeze. My point is that whether someone is mild-mannered or more primitive has no effect on human capabilities. Cold-blooded killer. For a more accurate picture, I am a 5 feet 8 125 pound female. Edited to add a closing sentence, edited again to add that I'm a female. He was planning to escape marshals on a hang glider. Was he a Bond villain? Buddy of mine was deployed to go help hunt him down in the woods. I was very worried for him, but it's always great to hear his stories, and especially this one. Edit. So he is in Sea Green. You from the area? I'm a senior officer with my department, and I can say from my perspective that this happens quite a lot. When I was a rookie, I worked with an inmate who was serving life with parole for multiple sexual assault charges and escaped from county jail. But I remember always thinking to myself that he seemed like a completely normal guy who hadn't let the prison politics get to him at all. He was one of my culinary workers, and he would always do any job I asked of him without question or attitude. And to top it all off, he was a military veteran who would even reminisce with our sergeant, who was also a veteran, about their past deployments. It was so bizarre to see someone who could have very well been my neighbor serving such a lengthy sentence for such an awful crime. Do you ever get additional information on these guys? I'm not familiar with how things work in a prison, so I don't know if you could request access to research done into this guy's past about why he did what he did. We can get access to their pre-sentence investigation report, C, which includes a detailed police report regarding their initial arrest, but typically that type of information is in a need-to-know basis. We train new officers to not look too far into an inmate's criminal record if they don't need to, as it can affect their ability to treat every inmate with the same firm, fair, and consistent mindset. Corrections nurse here. Never interacted with this inmate. I just see him out on the yard as I come into work. He collects bread crusts and I always see him feeding the birds, and the birds trust him and fly straight to his hand to eat. He looks like a nice enough guy from a distance, and birds only land on the hands of Disney princesses, right? Well, one day I caught him in a moment. A particularly fat pigeon landed on his hand and bent down to eat. He closed his fist on the pigeon's head and flicked his wrist to snap its neck. Its body was still flailing as he calmly put it into his pocket and then put out his hand again to feed more birds. I was told he was going to cook and eat it, which made me feel a little better. But still. And that's what comes to my mind every time an inmate is nice to me. I am trying to imagine how an inmate could dress and cook a pigeon without getting caught. Late 70s, early 80s. Shortly before I got paroled, I earned fishing privileges and could chill on the banks of a nearby river. Many a bream, bass, crappie, and catfish came back from the river with me and were fried for me by another inmate. Sam would also fry a pigeon upon request, and payment dart. I had an old school popcorn popper, similar to this, YouTube webpage, without the plastic top that was very functional for braising tough beef smuggled from the kitchen. Others had stuff ranging from pots to stingers. YouTube webpage. COs generally are vastly more interested in going home safely than in giving an inmate a ration of shit for grins and giggles. So things that are technically contraband are somehow not seen during searches if the inmate holding them is not a total fuck up. There is a lot of flexibility and go along to get along in prisons. Tell us some more stories, old guy. Catching fish in prison sounds awesome. The best I did was BBQ some lamb chops. It's difficult to tell some of the more interesting stories because that could lead to identification of people other than me. One fun thing that occurred a couple of years in a row was growing weed on the prison farm. There were numerous fields, many of which served as pasturage for dairy and beef cattle. Especially in the case of the dairy herd, this meant someone had to go out and round them up for milking. That led to a couple of folks that had unsupervised time out on the property, which inevitably led to extra cash crops. The crap we grew was fugly, probably about 6% minus 8% THC content. But it got you high if you smoked a couple joints. It also sold pretty well, especially in the last couple days before weekend visiting when family could risk bringing in the good stuff. Getting it inside the compound was amazingly easy. Several inmates had approved gardens and would daily bring in fresh picked and washed veggies. One need merely have a suitable box. Think cheap cardboard originally used to hold a case of canned foods. Place your herbs in the bottom of the box and spread a layer of newspaper over it. Put the still dripping wet produce on top of the newspaper and walls through the gate, knowing full well the CO was not going to get their hands wet digging around in the veggies you grew. There were arsehole guards that would dig around just to hassle you by putting their hands on your food. But they all followed a schedule and you just didn't bring in anything when one of them was on the gate. Write some memoirs or something. Even if they have to be released anonymously or in a number of years. You sound like you've got some really interesting life experience to share. Would absolutely love to hear anything else you can safely share. If they can make a functioning gun out of supplies found only in their cell, I think gutting and cooking a pigeon is a relatively small feat. FDFY. Try and imagining having every hour of every day to work on something for a year or 10. Maybe you could learn to play piano, or perhaps how to field dress a pigeon and BBQ it with a Bic lighter. I was told he was going to cook and eat it, which made me feel a little better. But still, we're just going to ignore this. Edit. Apparently pigeon is commonly eaten, not up here in Canada land. We must be too busy eating poutine to eat pigeon. Edit 2. For every upvote I get, I assume those people haven't eaten pigeon. But for every one upvote there are 2 comments saying I'm the weird one for not having tried pigeon. Maybe I live a sheltered life IDK. He was farming. Good for him. But are you allowed to cook and eat pigeons in prison? Not a CO. But I did work in a prison. Lots of inmates were seemingly decent people. One guy in particular was a hitman. He and his story were well known at the time. When I met him, I had no idea who he was and wondered what he could have done to land in prison. When I found out who he was, I read one of the books about him. That guy was pretty brutal. I always imagined professional hitmen would be the most likely to be nice people. Well, as nice as you can be when your job is literally killing people for money. That said, probably low empathy, so very capable of doing very fucked up shit. Watch the first, or second, I can't remember, episode of Dark Tourist on Netflix. The guy hangs out with Pablo Escobar's #1 hitman. And it is very much the dilemma you're talking about. More than once the host says, "How are you such a nice guy?" or, "I know I shouldn't like you as a person but you're so cool it's really funny." I really dislike the host's disrespectful behavior in this. He could get killed easily. Yet I really liked the basis of the show but ended up stopping after 3 episodes because the host was insufferable. If you're doing a show on weird cultural shit, you probably shouldn't be such a judgmental prick the entire time. I'll check it out next time I feel like binging on some crime stuff. I always had a fascination with hitmen. Super normal people like 80% of the time. But they accept money to kill people. That's not really how it works. People in the Italian mafia have talked about the subject before. Not everyone kills people. Not everyone tortures people. They would have certain people that would naturally gravitate to that kind of thing. I'm guessing the best hitman would be a true sociopath, so they pretend to be super normal people like 80% of the time, but only to help themselves get ahead in the world. Behind closed doors they are super fucked up people 100% of the time. I was a federal parolee counselor working in a halfway house reacclimation program. Most of my clients were capital offenders coming out of 20+ prison stints. Most of the clients were actually great people at face value, outside of drug distribution, which most of my clients were in prison for. I had murderers, rapists, major assault and child molesters, as well as some pretty notorious biker gang guys, who all have committed some heinous crimes but usually get busted for a slew of less violent things. Indiana biker gangs, for example, were big on rolling casinos and auto theft, so that's what they'd get slammed for. I gotta say that I don't remember having a single client who wasn't a nice person. It's easy to read their files and go, holy shit, this guy is demented as fuck, but you learn to desensitize to that and do your job at reacclimating them back into society. I did have one guy who was caught moderating a child porn ring and served 18 years of his 25-year sentence. He was on lithium, chlorpromazine and benztropine. Very strange guy. Feeble, soft-spoken, very small frame. Probably around 65 years old and genuinely kind. That is until one day when he refused his meds for some goddamn reason. He walked right into my office on a scheduled education verification check and went berserk. Flipped my desk, stabbed himself in the neck with a pencil, threatened to sodomize my whole family, and ended up laying on the ground trying to chew the wood leg off my desk. This all happened in about 20 seconds before we could restrain him and call the police. I'd never seen such a blatant portrayal of a mental health issue in my life. Still fucks me up to this day. I have a lot of random stories about my clients, but most are positive, and most of those guys were easy to get along with and great people if you didn't know their history. Former company. Absolutely all the time. I usually found myself having pleasant conversations with inmates almost like they are old buddies, only to find out they are in for horrendous crimes. Had one guy who was super kind, trying to give me advice. I was a 19-year-old, fresh-faced CEO, about how to manage inmates with my inferior agent size. Super kind and respectful. I looked him up on our system to see what he was in for, expecting something small, to find he was in for murder and arson in the first degree. Honestly, the both comforting and terrifying thing is majority of inmates are just like everyone else who just have made bad, some really bad, choices. TV greatly over-exaggerates criminals to be sociopaths, set in their ways, and inhumane. It puts into perspective how easily you could be on the other side of the bars. That last sentence should be a reminder for anyone. It is easy to get oneself in a situation when you might overreact or make a in hindsight dumb choice. Not all criminals are serial killers or members of gangs. The majority of murders happen in a friend-family setting for a reason. Former caseworker, state prison, CO, and jailer. Frequently the people you meet interact in a normal manner. If I didn't know what their past was, you wouldn't be able to guess. 3 are most assuredly exceptions to this. I've had inmates on my caseload that most definitely did not deserve prison. I've also had a few that I have no issue believing they have no soul. I work in juvenile corrections. There are a lot of pretty nice kids that have done some pretty fucked up shit. One in particular is a little 12-year-old that gets constantly picked on by the other inmates because he is short and he has bowel problems, so he has to wear diapers. Turns out he molested multiple little kids, would trap rats to break their spines, and had a habit of throwing cats off of tall buildings to see if they land on their feet. Supervisor here. I run chow each morning, and a while back there was a guy who would come through the line each morning smiling and being quite friendly and personable, saying good morning lieutenant. He was friendly enough that I had never bothered to look him up as far as his crime details. Much later I go to his unit to visit the officer and notice a strange open letter on the officer's desk. I ask about it and the officer tells me, oh yeah, that's from Jones. He's been trying to get back to his Caribbean country for years. Turns out the guy has dual citizenship and wants to get transferred there. He can't though because his crime was committed in our state. He had gotten in a big argument with his wife outside his house one winter night and beat her to death and then cut off her head. He then took the head and left the body on the doorstep. Even more messed up was that he left their 2-year-old with the body. Police later received a call about a crying child and found the kid holding on to his dead mother in the snow. The kid was cold but unharmed. The inmate still comes through the line just as friendly as can be. I wish him good morning in return, but keep a bit closer eye on him now that I know his background. Former CO here. One particular inmate fit this bill for me. I worked third shift on a housing unit and as such, had to oversee the floor cleaning crew, comprised of 7 or 8 inmates, one of whom was their supervisor. The supervisor was a guy I just didn't understand. He was about 50, extremely polite, worked his ass off, never got into trouble or broke the rules, always kept his guys on task. I didn't get it. I knew he had been in since he was 18 but never bothered to look up his crime until I was about to leave the job. Sure enough, it was bad. At 18 he had abducted, raped, and kept a 13-year-old girl in his parents' basement for about a week. I think it was his parents who turned him in. Former inmate here. Long story short, I was sentenced to state prison for selling small amounts of marijuana, and during my time in the high security classification facility I enrolled in a Jewish study group to meet people and pass the time. One of the other regular members happened to be a former professor of economics from UPenn, specializing in game theory, who happened to be a real nice and personable guy if you could just look past the fact he was there for beating his wife to death with a crowbar over a divorce settlement. Needless to say, we made a lot of prisoner's dilemma jokes. I think the most upsetting part of this story is that selling a small amount of marijuana sends you the same place as the guy who beat his ex-wife to death. Not my story but my mother's. Also, she wasn't a correction officer, but apart from that, we're right on topic. And X200B. She was a social worker in Gloucestershire. In the mid-1990s, she was asked by the police to attend the interviews of a suspect during pre-trial questioning to ensure the mental health of the suspect. And X200B. That individual was Rose West. Rosemary West. Wikipedia webpage. Conviction. And X200B. In her 30-plus year career working with some of the most damaged people in society, the weeks she spent doing this were among the most distressing for her, personally, partly because of the horrific details of what Rose and her husband, Fred, did, partly because of the utterly calm way in which Rose dismissed all the accusations made against her by the police, but not least because in between the questioning, when they took breaks, Rose was a friendly, polite, pleasant individual, nattering quietly with my mother about shopping, clothes and other random small talk. I went on a Tinder date with a girl who taught in a prison. She said that a woman inmate was mixing paint in an art class and just commented HMM. I've mixed concrete this color before. That didn't faze her at all. After all, the paint was the color of concrete. until someone told her that the inmate was Rose West. Ah, yes, that famous concrete color urban patio with a hint of teenage girl's blood. Current CO here. Back when I worked with juveniles, I had one kid that was very quiet, relatively well behaved, and friendly enough that it almost made you forget that he'd beaten his sister down, duct taped her to the bed, and brutally raped her. Or the similar kid that was involved in the shooting death of a 9-month-old baby. Working with juveniles sucks. That would obviously be horrible no matter who he did it to, but his own sister? Holy shit. I worked in a small prison in Germany. Now and then, when the other prisons in the area were over capacity, we'd get the odd weekend guest, mostly abusive spouses who were locked up for a few days so their sir had the chance to pack a few bags in peace to get away, drunks who'd gone on a rampage, that kind of thing. I worked there for 8 years, and during that time there was one guy who was a recurring guest. He was in his late 50s, always well dressed, very friendly, educated, extremely compliant with our rules, quiet, basically the kind of inmate you want if you work in a place like this. As a woman I never had much to do with him, but my colleagues always reported that the guy was almost a joy to meet and work with. He was a stalker. The object of his obsession was a young woman from his small town neighborhood. He'd relentlessly terrorized her for the better part of 10 years, starting when she was in her late teens. Thousands of phone calls, letters, attempts to get into her parents' house apartment, not sure which it was, following her on the streets. The stalker laws, when it started, basically said that as long as he didn't do anything to her physically, there was nothing that could be done. I have no idea why the family didn't move away from that town to protect her. The times he was locked up, it was for attempts of breaking and entering. He ended up killing her. Edit. Spelling stuff. I am not a CO, but I work in addictions recovery. You realize that everyone is fundamentally the same when you get wrecked in a game of Magic the Gathering by a Latino gangbanger with teardrop tattoos. That guy could sling spells like nobody's booziness. He was also really good at killing people apparently. Not a corrections officer, but I went on a trip to a prison in college in the UK a few years back. Met a bunch of inmates and sat in this room with a bunch of my classmates with them sitting intermingled with us. We chatted with them and there was one guy that seemed really nice and genuine. When asked why he was in there he explained that there were a gang of guys that broke into his mate's house during a party, hit the guy's girlfriend with a hammer and robbed the people there. I could be misremembering but I'm pretty sure that was the gist. He then said that his mate called him to go beat the shit out of the guy that did it and he agreed to help his mate out. It got out of hand. His mate killed the guy after he had conveniently left and then he was arrested and sent to prison. We kinda sympathized with him and he seemed like a nice guy. Once we had left the prison one of the officers explained what had really happened. Apparently it was in the local news when it had happened. Turns out him and his mate had gone to the guy's house, beast the shit out of him and then used hammers to fucking mince his body and ran over it with a car a few times. When the body was found they said it was so disfigured they didn't know where the head on it was. The idea that a guy that I'd sat next to and shaken hands with had done that was quite strange. I interned at a mental health ward for kids. On my first day, I just played cards and basketball with all the kids to get to know them. One girl stuck out to me. She was a little kooky, but had a great sense of humor and was amazing at I described her as a budding card shark to my internship group. On my second day, I read the kids' files. Miss Card Shark was in there for killing her family's dog. I was so shaken. I considered asking to switch to a different internship, but ended up staying. MCS had actually been there for 2 years and was in the final stages of successful treatment. So for the rest of my time with her, she was just like any other kid. It was definitely weird, though, when she was playing games with other kids and would jokingly say, "I'll kill you." I am a CO. Twice a week I go and get an inmate to clean up offices in the facility. He has access to lots of things he could kill me with, has killed people, and as a former shot caller, has had lots of people beat down, stabbed, and some killed. I love to read, and this guy has read pretty much every book written, as he's been in seg so much that he just read all day, all the time. Since I don't share any personal details with inmates, whether they just stole a truck or killed kids or talked in theaters real heinous shit, you know, and keep my life on lockdown. Books are a safe topic. He is very smart, and has a grasp of literature and its impact that is refreshing and enjoyable. I love talking with Garnell, made up name, about books while he cleans, and I make sure he doesn't get into off-limits areas or kill anyone. Worked on Texas death row as a CO from 2003 to 2005, then again a little later from 2006 to 2007. The whole experience was pretty wild, but very controlled. Every time an inmate was taken out of their cell, they were handcuffed, some in even more restrictive restraints. We even had cameras installed in some of the very high risk for offense cells, and had those dudes on 24-hour in-cell surveillance. It took me a solid year to feel comfortable walking into the cell blocks, but it became very routine. Only on rare occasions did those routines become construed, and you can bet your bottom dollar that when they became construed, you would hear all types of shit from inmates and officers alike. But there was an inmate I remember always keeping his complete cool, whether we had to give him a sack lunch because we were locked down or we had to postpone his shower reckyard visit. He never got upset, like so many other hotheads did. He was a big, beefy dude and could have easily physically harmed a lot of my co-workers, including myself, even with handcuffs on. The dude would work out for his entire time in the day room rec yard, but he was real quick to apologize and be nice to everyone, even the new COs. I'm sure you are thinking that this is just ploy to stoke a friendship, or maybe solicit COs, but he never once approached me to even so much as pass a magazine or newspaper down the cell block run. He was just cool, like a dude that fucked up at way too young of an age, and had the book thrown at him in the courtroom. I won't say his name, but he was executed in 2011. And at the time he committed his offense, he was 19 years old. My old supervisors would encourage all of the officers to not get online to look at offenses made by the inmates, because it could skew your judgment, provide a means of bias, but in this case, I did. He killed a couple guys running a crack house, and shot a 15-year-old girl in that same crack house. I'm not sure of all the details, but I always felt like there was more to his story. Not a CO, but every person that came in contact with Edmund Kemper said he was well-spoken and seemed like a gentle giant, until he started talking about his crimes. I think that's what makes him the most fearsome serial, in my opinion. Because with the way he talks and seems kind at first, I probably would have been a young dumb kid that would have gotten in his car too. He's the only famous serial killer I've heard of that actually turned himself into the police. Without that they might not have caught him. The guy denied to use his own apparel back in 2012 too. His portrayal on Mindhunter is horrifying. The actor did an amazing job. I don't know if you've ever seen the series Mindhunter, but the scenes featuring Ed Kemper are considered to be 100% accurate, because they are based on actual interviews he gave to the FBI and to television on the nature and mindset of serial killers. I've seen the interviews that he's conducted on TV as well. The casualness with which he describes severing his mother's head from her body and fucking it because she kept complaining that she hadn't had sex in years because of him is enough to send chills down your spine. I have to agree. Kemper is probably one of the more evil-minded among famous killers. I've seen the interviews. He's so emotionless when talking about the crimes, especially killing his mother. To be fair, his mother sounded like a fucking demon. Combine this with the fact that Kemper was almost 7 feet tall, which got him rejected from his dream job of being a highway patrolman. And, I mean, yikes. Obligatory, not a corrections officer, but I am an intake mental health therapist, and we see a large number of people who are put on probation, respecting confidentiality and all. There was one guy I remember who was in his early 50s, had done some objectively horrible things, and it all stemmed from trauma reactions. He grew up severely abused and neglected, and he wanted so much to just be able to be left alone to live life, as he knew he couldn't function in society. It was heartbreaking. Not a CO, but a cop. Arrested a dude one time for raping his granddaughter an uncountable number of times and videotaping it, producing child pornography, and possessing hundreds of GB of child porn. He would show his granddaughter the porn and tell her that's what granddaughters do for grandfathers. She was 6. He was a normal, nice dude with us, cooperative and had a pretty good family life. Doesn't change the fact that he was an evil fuck who is going to die in prison. I still think about that case a lot. I wonder how the girl is doing. I've often thought about checking in with the family, but I didn't want to rekindle any past memories. Hope they are well. I know he'll never taste freedom again. I have an inmate who got his own teen daughter pregnant. He's back with us because he was paroled for the initial offense. Pause for and why do the fucking rapists AMD child molesters get the lightest fucking sentences ? I had a getaway driver in a heinous arson case finally get paroled after 40 years. He was 16 at the time. But the scumbag who molested a 5-year-old girl and bit her vulva in the process was paroled after 3 years. What the fucking fuck? I'm even to everyone. But this is insanity. Rant over. Sorry y'all, but violated the protective order his ex-wife had. He's such a whiny bitch, and bitches about his family all the time. How about don't rape your family, maybe they'd like you more. Fucking idiot. Semi-relevant. My father worked in a maximum security prison for over 20 years. His friends were all inmates. He said they were nicer than most of the people who worked there. One of them, Doc, was a cool guy and knew how to tool and craft with leather. He made my family all kinds of gifts over the years, checkbook covers with our name on them, a belt with Lincoln Mario for my brother, a black belt covered in flowers for me, etc. We also had paintings that prisoners had made, and my dad spent time in the ceramics room making things with prisoners. A prisoner etched on glass a cartoon of me opening a gift box and finding a kitten inside. He gave it to me, told me to be careful and that the picture would be lost if the glass broke. And I still have it. It's right next to me on my shelves. I asked my dad about Doc one day. What did he do? He found his wife in bed with another man and shot him. Why do we have so many things that prisoners like Doc made? Because everyone deserves a second chance. And X200B. He denies to this day that he said such a thing. He loves to needle me about politics because we disagree. But I know deep down he's still the man who believes in second chances. Former CO. But the thing that really strikes you is how normal they are. I had an inmate who was going through a rough divorce and got drunk, rode his bike up to his soon-to-be ex-wife's house and dismembered her with a kitchen knife and then fell asleep in his old bed. He would pace in his cell all night and tell people who asked he was just reflecting on how he got there, had never been in trouble before, was very intelligent, and was always very kind and caring. I maintain that if he ever got out, he won't, I would have a coffee with him and catch up. I've spent a year with a prisoner. I was fellow inmate. The sickest, most wild guy, would talk all the time, and he was friendly and nice but would turn on you in seconds if you said something wrong. Super short fuse. Screaming off the handle. You always had a sense of no soul in his eyes. Both of my parents work at a psychiatric hospital for people who are found mentally incompetent to stand trial, or that are awaiting assessment for it. My mom never wants to know what people did, because she doesn't want it to color her opinion of them. Sometimes surreal things happen, like a guy standing in the yard looking really hard at something just outside the fence. She asked him what he was doing and he said, "Look at that weird bird. Do you see that tall bird over there? It keeps looking at me." She just told him she couldn't see it, but her eyesight was bad, and it was outside the fence, so he was safe. He accepted that answer and wandered off. There are so many that are locked up because they have mental issues. Get arrested for walking down the street naked or something. Get institutionalized. Get medicine. Get better. Get released. Quit taking medicine. Repeat. But there are some that did really horrific things, and that will never see freedom again. Some guy murdered his mother and cut out her heart and pissed in the cavity. That's the one that really sticks out. Very nice, docile dude. Gotta wonder if he just lost his mind, or if she did something awful to him. Quite honestly, most of the sex offenders I work with are the nicest, most understanding inmates I've ever met, and that bothers the shit out of me. I don't read their arrest reports anymore because the last guy who was super nice to me I found out sodomized his own son while his wife and daughter were sleeping. That was the first and last time I read those papers. Obligatory, not a correction officer, but I had a similar job. One of the nicest, most polite, likable inmates that I worked with was serving time for assaulting an off-duty police officer. The officer was in the hospital for months and had serious brain damage to where he will never recover and live his normal life again. If I didn't know the backstory and just met this inmate on the street, I would have thought he'd be someone I'd be friends with. He was kind, calm, and funny and liked by all the staff, and never would have been pegged as someone who would commit such a crime. However, shockingly enough, he was never sorry about his actions or said he regretted what happened or anything. Maybe his likable personality was just a ruse, but it worked. I was on the other side of the bars, but I'll say this: most inmates are genuinely really nice people. When I was in jail, I met a great guy. He poured liquid Drano on his neighbors, but when he wasn't a complete psychopath, he volunteered at a soup kitchen and played piano at the community center. Super friendly, charming, funny, good cook. The guy was a model citizen, except of course for the trying to kill people with house cleaners thing. I had a 15-year that was to have surgery on his middle finger. It had been broken 3 or 4 weeks prior fighting in jail, so it was partially healed and looked super fucked up. He was cold and distant, didn't say much, but I could tell he was scared to be put to sleep. I tried to comfort him. When they started to sedate him, he started to cry, just tears running down his face. I held his non-broken hand and wiped his tears away. Once he was completely out, the surgeon pretty much cussed me out for being too kind to this kid. Really embarrassed me. Told me that he was a ruthless criminal. That him and his friend had robbed the home of one of his fellow surgeons, tied up the surgeon and his wife, and ended up shooting the wife dead. I immediately felt even more sorry for the kid. He was 14 when the crime happened. Just a stupid fucking kid. and ended up taking the life of a wife and mother. Now he was alone and destined for life and prison, trying to be hard but scared shitless to be in surgery. He should be with his mom, getting kissed before rolling back, but he was shackled up until he was 100% knocked out from anesthesia. I wouldn't have treated him any different if I had known his crime. That's what makes me a good nurse and him a shitty surgeon. Give a case to someone else if you can't handle the emotion. Edit. This surgeon I'm speaking of is a total piece of shit. I've seen him close up hips that are obviously not properly set on old women, like people's grandmas. Then when the post-op x-ray shows this mistake, he blames it on the staff that transported that patient after surgery. He only hugs pretty women, and not in a normal way. He holds them at the hips to hug them. I'm one of the attractive nurses who hides when I see him coming down the hall, just to avoid that disgusting hug. He's known for cheating on his wife. He's old and needs to quit, but one of his mistresses sued him 15 years ago and he lost a lot of money, so he's still working. He's also been sued for malpractice. He's a complete jackass. He wears cowboy boots with black scrubs that are 3 sizes too small.